For nearly a decade, American Chopper made the Tatul family one of the most recognizable names on television. A father and his sons built motorcycles by day and shouted each other into legend by night, and millions of viewers tuned in every week to watch both. The show turned a small fabrication shop in upstate New York into a household brand, and it made Paul Tatul Sr., Paul Tatul Jr., and Mikey Tatul into reality TV royalty. Before it became a hit, it was really just a documentary crew following a father-son business that customized motorcycles for a niche crowd of collectors and bikers. Nobody involved expected it to become appointment television, and almost nobody involved was prepared for what fame would eventually cost them. Because cameras only show what they're pointed at, and behind the wrenches, the welding sparks, and the screaming matches, the finances of almost everyone connected to Orange County Choppers were quietly falling apart. Lawsuits piled up. Bankruptcies were filed. A family business turned into a family battlefield, and by the time the dust settled, almost nobody involved had the empire they once had on screen. What audiences saw was a workshop that seemed to print money every time a finished bike rolled out the door for a client or a corporate sponsor. What was actually happening behind the scenes was a business built on wildly inconsistent income, a shrinking market for extremely expensive custom motorcycles, and a family whose personal relationships were falling apart in front of a national audience at the exact same time their company's financial foundation was cracking. This is the real story of what happened to the cast of American Chopper once the cameras stopped rolling and where each of them ended up. When American Chopper premiered on Discovery in 2003, Paul Tatul Sr. looked like a man who could never be beaten. The mustache, the crossed arms, the sleeveless shirts, the temper that could fill an entire garage. He was the show's engine, and Orange County Choppers looked unstoppable. What audiences didn't see was that the custom motorcycle business is a brutal one to run long-term. It depends on a narrow, wealthy clientele willing to pay six figures for a one-off bike, and that market shrank dramatically once the 2008 financial crisis hit and the custom chopper fad that fueled the show's popularity cooled off. By the mid-2010s, the cracks were showing. In 2016, the massive Newburgh, New York, headquarters that had been the star of countless episodes was auctioned off. Then in March 2018, just days before Discovery's American Chopper revival premiered, Paul Sr. filed for Chapter 13 bankruptcy. Court paperwork revealed a man far from the mogul viewers remembered, roughly $1.07 million owed to more than 50 creditors, monthly income around $15,000, and monthly expenses close to $12,600, on top of tens of thousands owed in unpaid state taxes. His attorney called the filing proactive, a way to restructure rather than collapse, but the numbers told their own story about how far the business had fallen since its peak. The legal troubles didn't stop at bankruptcy. In 2017, former business partner Thomas Derbyshire sued Paul Sr., alleging that money meant for a new television project had been misused. Then, in February 2020, a federal judge sided with photographer Scott Gunnels, who had accused Paul Sr. and Orange County Choppers of using his copyrighted images in merchandise and promotions without permission, a judgment that cost Paul Sr. more than $250,000. Around the same period, his longtime Montgomery, New York, mansion, a fixture of the original show, went through foreclosure proceedings and was eventually sold for far less than he had hoped to get for it. Rather than disappear, Paul Sr. rebuilt on a smaller scale. When the pandemic hit in 2020, the New York chapter of Orange County Choppers effectively closed, and Paul Sr. relocated the brand to Florida. In June 2021, the OCC Roadhouse and Museum opened in the Clearwater area, a scaled-down version of the empire he once ran, combining a working shop with a bar, restaurant, and museum space for fans. He kept building bikes, kept doing appearances, and kept his name in front of an audience that had never really left. And the story isn't finished. In late 2025, Paul Sr. confirmed that a new series, Orange County Choppers Original, was heading to Discovery and Motor Trend in 2026, bringing him back to national television alongside longtime crew members like Rick Petco and Mikey Tatul. It's a strange kind of second act. The man who once ran a headquarters big enough to host corporate sponsors, celebrity clients, and full television crews now runs something closer to the shop he started with decades earlier. Smaller, leaner, and rebuilt almost entirely around his own hands-on involvement rather than a sprawling business empire. Estimates of his current net worth vary wildly depending on the source, from roughly $500,000 to figures many times higher once his TV and business income are factored back in. And that gap alone says something about how murky celebrity finances can be once the cameras and the courtroom filings stop lining up. What isn't in dispute is the arc. A man who built a multi-million-dollar operation, lost most of it to debt, lawsuits, and a shrinking market, and chose to start over in a new state rather than walk away from the industry that made him famous. If Paul Sr. was the temper of American Chopper, Paul Jr. was its imagination, the son who could turn a sketch into a motorcycle that looked like sculpture. But the same 2008 blow-up that defined the show's most famous storylines also ended his job. After a filmed argument that season, Paul Sr. fired his own son, and what followed was a legal fight over Paul Jr.'s roughly 20% ownership stake in the company. Paul Sr. tried to force a buyout, and the appraiser he hired valued Jr.'s share at essentially nothing, a number that outraged fans and family alike. The dispute made its way through the courts, and by December 2010, a judge ruled the buyout terms weren't enforceable as written, leaving Paul Jr.'s ownership intact even as the relationship between father and son was left in ruins. Paul Jr. moved on and, after sitting out a one-year non-compete agreement, launched Paul Jr. Designs in 2009, opening it for business in Montgomery, New York, the following year. For a while, it worked. Corporate clients wanted custom builds with his name attached, and the shop found a niche making high-end bikes and branded merchandise away from his father's company. But the custom motorcycle market that had cooled for Orange County choppers cooled for Paul Jr., too. Building one-of-a-kind machines is expensive, and demand for six-figure custom bikes never fully returned to its mid-2000s highs. Like his father, Paul Jr. eventually filed for Chapter 13 bankruptcy, listing significant debts alongside assets that included his home and business equipment. Even so, Paul Jr. Designs never closed its doors. Today it operates as a smaller, leaner shop, still based in Montgomery, still producing custom builds, and still selling apparel under the Paul Jr. Designs name, though nowhere near the scale of the empire that Tattooed name once represented. Paul Jr. has continued to take on selective, high-profile projects over the years, and has occasionally appeared as a guest judge or commentator within the custom motorcycle world, keeping his name relevant in an industry that has changed dramatically since his television heyday. He also settled down away from the spotlight, marrying in 2010 and building a life around his family in New Jersey and New York rather than chasing the fame that once defined him. Reports suggest Paul Sr. and Paul Jr. have largely reconciled on a personal level since the show ended, even if they've chosen not to work together again professionally. Given how public and how bitter their falling out played out on camera, right down to a courtroom fight over what Paul Jr.'s share of the company was even worth. That reconciliation is arguably one of the more understated success stories to come out of the entire American Chopper saga. Paul Jr. has kept a lower public profile than his father in recent years, focused on running his own business rather than chasing another reality television comeback, a quieter kind of survival than the one that made him famous, built on steady, smaller-scale craftsmanship rather than another shot at a national spotlight that had already cost his family so much the first time around. Mikey Tattooed was never the designer or the boss. On screen, he was the one who broke the tension, the guy answering phones, taking out the trash, and cracking jokes while his father and older brother nearly came to blows. But off-screen, Mikey was dealing with something the show only partially let viewers see, a serious struggle with alcohol addiction. In December 2009, it became public that Mikey had checked himself into rehabilitation, and not long after, he was pushed out of his role at Orange County Choppers entirely, a moment Paul Sr. explained by saying his son had been given chances at the company he didn't follow through on. Rather than disappear from view, Mikey rebuilt his life away from the shop floor. He leaned into painting, opening a gallery in Montgomery, New York, called the Wolfgang Gallery to show his own artwork, though the gallery eventually closed a couple of years later due to declining sales. He also tried his hand at entrepreneurship with FarQ Products, a line of homemade gourmet pasta sauces he developed and tried to market under his own name, a business that had nothing to do with motorcycles and everything to do with Mikey carving out an identity separate from the Tattoo name that had defined him his entire life. Over the years, he's dabbled in stand-up comedy, taken the stage doing sets built around his own life story, and launched a podcast where he and a longtime friend and former OCC employee talk through their years at the shop, the good moments and the ugly ones, with a candor the show itself rarely allowed. Mikey also returned in a smaller capacity to help out around both Orange County Choppers and his brother's shop when needed, working as an assistant general manager rather than the on-air personality he used to be. By most accounts, his relationship with his father has improved significantly since his rehab years, a rare bright spot in a family story defined mostly by conflict, and one that stands out precisely because so few of the other Tattoo relationships mended in the same way. Mikey's path was never about rebuilding a business empire the way his father and brother tried to. It was about rebuilding himself, one step removed from the cameras that once made his private struggles part of the plot, and by most measures, that quieter kind of comeback has held. Not every member of the Tattoo family appeared on American Chopper, and one of the most dramatic financial stories in the family's history belongs to someone viewers rarely saw. Daniel Tattoo, Paul Sr.'s second oldest son, took over the family's original business, Orange County Iron Works, separate from the motorcycle brand that made his father and brothers famous. In 2007, a bankruptcy trustee accused Daniel and other family members of shifting valuable equipment, employees, and accounts out of the original Iron Works entity and into a newly formed company, allegedly to avoid paying what was owed to creditors. When the case was resolved, Daniel, then only in his early 30s, was ordered to pay a substantial judgment, one significantly larger than the amounts Paul Sr. and Paul Jr. were separately ordered to pay in related proceedings. It could have ended his career before it really started. Instead, Daniel kept the Iron Works business running, worked to repair relationships with contractors and clients, and eventually expanded into new ventures in structural steel fabrication. It's a slower, less glamorous kind of business than building custom motorcycles for celebrities and corporate clients. Ironworks deals in the unglamorous, essential steel infrastructure that never makes it onto a reality show, from building framework to structural components for commercial projects. But that lack of glamour turned out to be its own kind of protection. Without a television audience demanding constant drama, without a network pushing for bigger builds and bigger deadlines, Daniel had the freedom to rebuild methodically, one contract at a time. There's also a quieter irony buried in Daniel's story. He was reportedly responsible for constructing the very Orange County Choppers headquarters that became instantly recognizable to millions of viewers, even though he never appeared on camera and rarely got public credit for the work. Away from the television spotlight, without a camera crew following his every decision, Daniel quietly built what has become one of the more stable businesses connected to the Tattoo name. Proof that the family's most lasting comeback story might belong to the one son who was never part of the show at all, and who never had to rebuild a public image because he never had one to lose. While the Tattoo family fought in front of the cameras, much of the actual bike building at Orange County Choppers fell to a small crew of fabricators who became fan favorites in their own right. And their post-show lives tell a quieter version of the same story, an industry that shrank faster than anyone on television let on. Vinny DiMartino was widely regarded as one of the most talented builders in the shop before he left the company in 2007 after several years there. He went on to launch his own custom motorcycle venture with a former OCC colleague, riding the tail end of the custom bike boom before the 2008 financial crisis crushed demand for expensive, one-off builds. Like so many shops in that era, the business eventually wound down, and DiMartino shifted into general automotive repair work, trading custom chrome for the more dependable business of fixing everyday cars and trucks. Rick Petco spent well over a decade commuting to the shop from Pennsylvania, appearing on camera while also working as a fabricator behind the scenes. Eventually, the travel and the chaos of the shop caught up with him, and he stepped away, returning home to Pennsylvania to work in the motorcycle industry closer to family before eventually branching into his own custom metalwork, including knives and jewelry, under his own small business. Cody Connolly joined the shop as a teenager and became one of its youngest recognizable faces. His relationship with the company soured after he felt his image and a custom motorcycle built for him on camera hadn't been handled fairly, and the dispute was eventually settled out of court. Connolly left the custom bike world behind entirely, moving into an unrelated trade far from television. Jason Pohl, who joined as a designer years into the show's run, often found himself the target of fan criticism for his more futuristic design style. He stayed with the company through its leaner years before eventually moving on to design work in a different industry, settling into a career that had nothing to do with reality television at all. None of these builders walked away rich from the show that made their faces recognizable to millions of viewers. What they walked away with was a trade, welding, fabrication, design, that let them build something more stable once the cameras and the custom bike boom both moved on. It's worth remembering that these were the men actually holding torches and grinders for most of every episode, while the Tatools argued in front of the lens. Their names rarely appeared in the lawsuits and bankruptcy filings that followed the show, mostly because they were employees rather than owners, but that also meant they never shared in whatever profits the business generated at its peak. When the custom chopper era ended, they didn't have a brand name to fall back on. They had a skill set, and for most of them, that turned out to be worth more in the long run than reality television fame ever was. What makes the American Chopper story unusual isn't that a reality TV business eventually struggled. Plenty of shows built around family businesses have ended in bankruptcy, lawsuits, and estranged relatives. What makes it unusual is how long the brand itself managed to survive its own collapse. Orange County Choppers filed for bankruptcy protection, lost its flagship headquarters, and relocated across the country, and it is still, somehow, building motorcycles under the same name more than 2 decades after the show first aired. Paul Jr. Designs went through its own bankruptcy and is still open. Even Daniels Iron Works, the company that produced the largest single legal judgment in the family's history, expanded rather than folded. Part of that resilience comes down to timing and luck, but part of it comes down to something the show itself never fully captured. These were, underneath the theatrics, genuinely skilled builders and fabricators. Reality television gave the Tatool family and their crew a spotlight, but the underlying trade, metal fabrication, motorcycle design, structural steel work, was real, transferable, and durable in a way that fame alone never is. When the cameras and the sponsorship deals dried up, the skills didn't. Taken together, the story of American Chopper isn't really about motorcycles. It's about what happens when a family business becomes a television show, and what happens to real people once the show that made them famous no longer needs them the way it once did. Paul Sr. filed bankruptcy the same week his comeback series premiered. Paul Jr. built an entire second company only to face the same financial cliff his father did. Mikey fought a private battle the show could only hint at. Daniel, who was never even on television, ended up owing more than anyone. And the builders who made the bikes that made the Tatools famous quietly went back to ordinary work once the custom chopper boom faded. What's remarkable is that almost none of them disappeared completely. Paul Sr. still runs OCC out of Florida and has a new series arriving on television. Paul Jr. still designs